Welcome, everyone, to Of Gods and Game Masters. This is Myths and Monsters, Kobolds, specifically. I am your host, Jack Kellum, also known as Jack Gogsbane, Jack the Giant Killer. You can find me all sorts of places, but then you probably know that if you're here. So that's not nearly as critical. My co host is the Lion Knight, findable all sorts of places under at the Lion Knight 42. And the producer and CEO of the fantastic company known as Tales from the Table Studios, where you can see me from time to time running games for him and working with him on other such matters. But far more important than the two of us today is our special guest, Jürgen Hubert, our German folklore expert, who will start us off with an introduction to kobolds in German myth and folklore, and then we'll start talking about linguistic roots and so on. Jürgen, if you would please introduce yourself and let folks know where they can find you.
Hello, my name is Jürgen, as you said, and my personal project for translating German folklore is called Sunken Castles Evil Pudes, sunkencastles.com. And this is something I started about 5-6 years ago when I discovered just how many old German folktales there were in the German language and available as digital scans. And when I thought to myself, well, most of these are totally unknown in the English language, so someone should translate them. That someone is me. So I'm still going after 5 years or so. I've translated 477 folktales so far, and I've released them all under Creative Commons Zero license, so anyone can do with them the translations whatever they want and use them for their own projects. Well, it's been lots of fun delving into old German folktales and folklore and seeing how to other people use them for podcasts, for shows like this one, for tabletop gaming. So it's been a really great journey so far.
Very nice. And I greatly appreciate it because that kind of dedication to expanding the access to folklore across the world, I think, is really important. Folklore and mythology are at their base this common language we share to talk about our roots, even when we're looking at very distinct folklore and mythology across multiple different cultures. There's so much in common in them as well, and they give us insight into the cultures that produce them. A great deal of knowledge can be learned about the time and the place and the culture of the people who tell a particular story. And their utility in tabletop gaming cannot be overrated. These are the original stories. These are the things that inspire everything we work with. And that's where now we're going to get into it with the kobolds. Kobold is a German term, correct me if I'm wrong, but it generally refers to a wide class of entities, much as goblin and hobgoblin do in English. And these entities are sort of like fey creatures. They're often invisible. They have a wide variety of locations and roles in a situation, from household spirits, as you mentioned, as we were talking earlier, familiar spirits, which you'll get into, you said, creatures that live in mines, creatures that live on ships, and interact with humans in a number of different ways. So give us some background on some of the earliest origins from your perspective on kobolds and their role in German folklore.
As I said, kobold is a very generic term. I'd like to compare it to the British goblin. It's basically just a name for small, mischievous spirits. They could play all sorts of roles in a folktale and narrative, and there were often very strong regional differences in how kobolds were interpreted. So in some regions there were very helpful spirits who did all the household chores, and others they were really demonic entities, and whoever owned them their souls were lost to the devil. So, and then they could also sometimes be bought and sold and captured, and each region has its own special type of narrative. So mentioned, in the English language, kobolds often have a history and association as mining spirits. I think I've been able to trace the origin of that because it starts like so many things with the Brothers Grimm, but not with the works on folklore and mythology, but with the German dictionary. So it's not as very known, but still very important for Germany because they were one of the first big dictionaries of the German language. And they had an entry for Cobalt, the mineral, and they mentioned that in parts of Saxony, the miners used to refer to any worthless minerals as Cobalt, because they believed that malicious spirits, the kobolds, had replaced worthwhile minerals and valuable minerals with worthless minerals. So far, so good, but this is only one example of kobolds, and there's no really general association with mines in German folklore. But there was this American folklorist and theologian and slave abolitionist named Moncure D. Conway, and he wrote a very important text, Demonology and Devil Lore, in 1878, I think. And when he
Devil Lore in 1876, you said.
Yes, and he cited the Brothers Grimm, but when he also built up an association of kobolds with mines, and when he said about when these imaginary beings were naturally associated with the dark recesses of mines. And as far as I can tell, this is something he came up, but when other English language sources started to cite him, and when this was further cited in later English language works and so forth, until finally the founders and first creators of Dungeons and Dragons used those texts and came up with an underground association for kobolds.
Right. So that a more generalized group of entities became specialized down into this underground niche, which it already shared with the English language version of the same exact thing, which was Goblin, which again had by the same process been rendered down into almost entirely underground malicious spirit. One of the things you brought up that I thought was really interesting, and I was aware of before we brought it up, the source of the word cobalt, as in the element or mineral cobalt, which, as Jürgen pointed out, it doesn't go the way you might think, where the creatures are named after the element. No, the element is named after the creatures because when they started finding it in the mines, as he pointed out, they thought it had been damaged by these spirits and caused to be this worthless mineral. What's interesting about that is that mine kobolds specifically are generally described as blue in color because of their exposure to that exact same mineral. You get that blue color sometimes the same way to a certain extent in human skin when they've been long-term exposed to it. And as an example in video gaming, at first, the blue skin of the character Brock in God of War is explained as being from his exposure to metals. It turns out in God of War Ragnarok that's not exactly true, but we're not going to get into that right now.
Spoilers!
It is originally explained that that's why his skin is blue.
It's also really interesting because I didn't I hadn't heard that origin for the kobolds, which is really cool, and that cobalt as the name of the mineral had sprung from it, and I think that's really, really exciting and interesting. It's so fascinating seeing how some of these things evolve, because my grandfather was on one of my parents' side was like very much into the rich like Germanic folklore. You know, he was from Germany, and his parents and all the way back were German, and the stories that I would hear were a lot less focused on the idea of the like mind spirits, and were more akin to, I don't love the term, but I'm going to use it because I feel like it hits the nail on the head. Sort of like house elves, almost.
Yep.
And it's really cool because, like you said at the beginning, it's this thing where it encompasses so many different concepts and brings them all together from all these different places. And it's fascinating to hear about.
The house elf version, the house servant, or in some case even slave version of the kobold, we're going to be talking about the D&D version of the kobold the most, probably because it has the widest impact on the modern conception of kobolds.
Sure.
And the way portrayed in all these other media. But there is one system that I will mention, as I brought up before, that actually grabs onto their existence as a household domestic servant spirit or entity, and that is GURPS. In the GURPS fantasy folk book that came out many years ago, and I believe we have a picture for this, the kobolds were small, yes, blue, one of the few times that they're mentioned as blue in tabletop role-playing, except for a very modern rendition, which we'll show at the end.
Sure.
And not particularly intelligent and treated as a servant or slave race by all the people around them, because they're treated in that setting like so many things. Household spirits and goblin spirits and all these things get translated into biological races or species in tabletop role-playing. And to a certain extent, I think that's a mistake. But we'll get into that more, actually, on May 28th at 3 p.m. when we talk about evil races in tabletop role-playing and why they're a problem and how to avoid the tropes associated. But that's a thing for another day. So GURPS kobolds, that comes like in the middle of the kobold narrative, right? We've got these GURPS kobolds, they're little blue people, they do housework. But the first D&D kobolds are literally only described as being vaguely goblin-like. But in the monster manual for first edition D&D, we have a picture of them, which shows them as vaguely dog-like, but they're scaled and with horns. And they talk about them being kind of a rust red in color. Why they're rust red, I don't know. Why they have horns, I don't know. But even here, you see that there's almost no visual connection to what they will eventually become, except maybe the horns, right? What does this particular picture look like in terms of that to you, Jürgen? What do you think the connection is?
Wer can I see this picture? Bild somewhere? Sorry.
Yeah, it's on the.
Give me a moment.
Yeah, he'll share it. Sorry.
Oh, good.
So yeah, in the earliest stuff, they're described as dog-like, as making yipping noises. That's even in the Keep on the Borderlands module, where they actually have a fairly significant.
It should be in the chat. The Zoom chat.
Okay.
Where they have a pretty significant presence. But yeah, originally they're just as, if anything, even weaker version of a goblin. Just, I guess, thrown in for some variety in the type of goblinoid creature you'd run into.
Yeah, it definitely does feel that way. There was, but even back then there was this very unique difference between them and a goblin, because they were weaker than goblins in first edition. They had the same hit points as a wizard. They were 1d4 HP. And it's fascinating because they shared some similar traits. The cowardice was already there, and the way that they very much easily bended to stronger forces were there. But there was still already sort of that kind of ingenuity coming out, and that craftsmanship and the creativity sort of coming together, which I'll talk more about in a moment after I do some troubleshooting.
It's not really that critical. So in second edition, we go to, it doesn't change a huge amount, but I do have a picture that they have for second edition. The big change happens about during this time period, and Lion just alluded to it, actually. And that's a sea change in their perception of how they're treated in D&D specifically and in tabletop role playing.
Mm-hmm.
Because of a thing called, correct me if I'm wrong, Tucker's Kobolds, which appeared in a Dragon magazine.
Actually, I can drop a lot of knowledge on this particular piece because it's one of my favorite things in D&D history. It was before 2nd edition that this happened, because it was in Dragon issue 126 or 127 that this came out. And it really set the stage not just for the kobold and what would become of them, but also it crafted a lot of what became combat tactics moving forward. Because it was this whole story about how they were in this dungeon and they were going through the dungeon, and then they're like only about 60 feet in. They hadn't even gotten that far in yet. And they get there, and then the door locks behind them. And there's this moment of quiet, and then the corridor goes up in flames. And the leader of the party notices one of the kobolds off in the distance, and they panic because they have to start running down these side passages, and they end up running into more kobolds who now are firing through murder holes with crossbows and are flinging down pieces of metal shrapnel and torches and Molotov cocktails at one point, and literally are forcing them into this just pit almost, this like kobold death pit. And it was one of the first times that we really saw what would, I guess, in modern terms be called pack tactics being utilized in TTRPGs and in D&D specifically. And it played such a huge role in what that would become as time went on. Monster tactics, enemy tactics, combat tactics, and went from just being, I walk up to the thing and smash it and it smashes me back, to being, well, this thing has wizard level hit points. It will die if I sneeze on it. But when there's 30, 40, 50, 60 of them in an area and they know you're coming, you're in trouble. And it was such... Say that again?
Because they're smart.
Yes, exactly. It's that ingenuity. They weren't just smart, they were creative. And it was one of the first times we really saw that in TTRPGs, where, again, a lot of monsters kind of got relegated to being the strong, smashy archetypes, or just the angry feral nightmares. They were small and easy to kill, except when they had friends, and they always had friends.
Yeah.
So we're going to get to 3rd edition here in a minute, but before we get to that, I want to go ahead and let Jürgen talk a little bit more about the other kinds of kobolds in German folklore, so that we can kind of get a vision as to where they diverged, which they obviously did.
Yeah, so for starters, you mentioned that kobolds come in Dungeons and Dragons come in large numbers, and that they use pack tactics. So this is a big divergence from German folklore right there, because kobolds were almost always singular entities, singular spirits. So when you had a group, you folklore would usually call them dwarves or something similar. But kobolds were individual beings. So sometimes they would show up in the wilderness and perhaps live in a cave, but mostly simply appearing at the roadside. And they were described in all sorts of ways, usually as little men, sometimes as grey little men, which I find interesting because of possible links to UFO grey aliens.
The connection to the grey aliens is interesting.
But most often they're described as wearing jackets, specifically red jackets, and often they were wearing some kind of hat. But they were also shape changers, so they could appear as all sorts of animals, such as birds or cockerel, as hares, as small pigs, as inanimate objects, including a dead cat in one story, a colorful ribbon, and sometimes, this is more uncommon to the role as familiars. They would appear as small creatures in a box, like a bumblebee or a worm. But there's also one story where one appears as a human, because basically a man living in a house had a kobold, and his soul was forfeit to the devil. But his wife had wanted to avoid the same fate, so and to do that, she must not speak a single word to the kobold. So the kobold transformed into a handsome officer, military officer. She knocked at the door, and she was impressed to talk to him, and so she was doomed.
Oof.
Yeah, and
It's interesting. You see the translation of the creatures that in many cases predate Christianity in the conception of the peoples of the various areas, and how they are almost universally across Europe, especially associated with the devil, with hell, with evil after Christianity moves into the area, right?
Sure.
And the connection, specifically for the kobold here, is that the kobold, as you're describing them, has a lot more in common with the leprechaun or the brownie than it does what we conceive of as the goblin, and certainly as what we conceive of as the kobold in tabletop role playing, right down to the red coats and the hats, because the leprechaun up till the 19th century was primarily described as wearing a red coat. The grand majority of small fey beings, whether malicious or not, were very often described as wearing red caps, which gets us into the red cap itself, but that's another episode. Even to the point where, and this is an interesting way off base thing, Japanese mermaids, known as the Ningyo, are often described as having red caps that confer water breathing, which is also a thing found, I think, in some Dutch myth, but I'm not 100% certain I'm remembering that correctly. I do know there is a European mermaid with a water breathing cap that it can give to humans as well, though. But yeah, so you've got your household spirits, you got your roadside spirits, you got your tricksters and their shapeshifters like the Irish puka. And there's only a little bit of them showing up in mines, right?
Yes, so they show up once or twice in case, but and I won't rule out that there are other tales where kobolds are explicitly said to inhabit mines. I mean, there are probably more than 100,000 German folk tales out there in the public domain, and even though I've been reading them for the past few years, I've still only read a small fraction of them.
Of course.
I have come quite a few tales about mining spirits, but they are usually called something else. Most commonly the Bergmönch or Mountain Monk.
Interesting.
Yeah. So usually called is described as a giant wearing the black robe of a monk, and who can also help or hinder miners depending on his attitude and the miner's attitude. But he's never described as a kobold as such.
Can you talk to me about a type of kobold known as the Heinzelmanken or Hanselman?
Yes, so this is basically just another name for the same class of spirits from a particular region. I think of the western parts of Germany. So they got some bigger international reputation because it shows up in the German legends collections of the Brothers Grimm. So not the Brothers Grimm's fairy tale collection, which is better known, but German legends, which was only translated once into English about 40 years ago, and the books are long out of print. One day I hope to provide a new translation.
That kobold spirit is that specific name for kobold spirit is also referenced in Neil Gaiman's American Gods.
Yes, I think he read the English language translation of Brothers Grimm German legends. That's my suspicion. So it shows up in that tale, but also in a few others from the region. So it's a common name for not just that single being. But if you look at that tale in the Brothers Grimm versions, I mean, he's not a child murderer like in Gaiman, but he's still a huge jerk. I mean, he does do chores in the household, but he also tyrannizes the entire household. So this is fairly typical for kobolds in larger households. So they have their own moral standards, and if domestic servants, maids, farmhands, and so forth don't measure up to standards. He punishes them, plays pranks on them, and there's also some female maids who takes a liking to, and so if he get any suitors, he chases them away, and
Right.
then and even the lord of the castle he lives in gets terrified by him and tries to get some exorcists to drive him away, and the kobold gets Heinz and gets very offended at this.
Oh, I imagine so. I'd get offended if you brought in a priest to tell me off and run me out of my house too.
Yeah,
But the way he's
Oh, go ahead.
but the way he's gaslighting the inhabitants that he's only doing what's best is it's kind of understandable. I mean, there's some other tales where such household spirits where they get disrespected. For example, it's often common to leave some milk for them and that they can drink. And one in 2 stories, boy working in the kitchens drinks the milk himself and mocks the kobold. So what does the kobold do? He kills the boy, chops him apart, and puts him into the big cauldron, and so where the cook can find it.
Yep.
And then the cook is horrified at this, but when the kobold tells him, take care that you don't share the same fate, because I told you that you should tell the boy that to not annoy me, but you didn't do so, so it's really your fault. So perfect gaslighting.
And 2 things I really want to talk about real quick here. One is, this is an ongoing theme that I find in a lot of folklore, is this escalation from 0 to 100, where it's like, yeah, they pull pranks and they do jokes. They'll like hide one of your shoes, or, you know, they'll squeeze some toad blood into your dinner, or, you know, cut you up and put you into a cauldron. Little things, no big deal. 0 to 100.
This is something I really like about those old folk tales. They simply don't follow modern narrative conventions.
Yes.
So they're extremely unpredictable, but they have a real chaotic energy that I, as a role-playing gamer, I'm really fond of. I mean, you have to understand, so the typical environment in Germany where such folk tales were told was the so-called spinning chamber. So in the long, cold winter nights, when it was got dark at 4 p.m. or so, when the people from one or several households would sit together in the main chamber of a farm. Then a fire was lit and the women would spin flags, and whenever one would entertain themselves by stopping gossip or singing songs or telling stories. So it was a real amateur sport, telling stories, which of course is very similar to role-playing games.
Oh yeah,
absolutely. I believe I tend to believe that tabletop role-playing especially is pretty much the most modern expression of the collaborative storytelling practice that goes back to humanity's earliest days.
Oh, wholeheartedly agree. Yeah.
It's literally one of our oldest pastimes. Yeah. Telling stories is one of the things that makes us human.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The only other thing that comes close is fan fiction writing.
Yes. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the other thing I want to touch on before we move on to anything else real quick is that pettiness that is this just running theme with the kobolds, even in their like basic folklore concept, is something that you do, and I'm very thankful for, see brought over for kobolds from first edition to now, and in pretty much every other TTRPG that I've seen them in is included, is just this very well conceptualized inability or unwillingness to let things go, and the lengths that they will go to get back at people for things or to hold those grudges. And I absolutely love it. I really do.
I think that's a generalized expression of this same thing you get with supernatural entities in general, especially those that in much of Europe are considered fae, right? Is this outsized response and vengefulness. Because of course, to a certain extent, a lot of these stories are boogeyman stories. They're stories of the right thing or X bad thing will happen. So the outcomes are outsized in order to instill the proper amount of fear to keep that behavior from occurring.
Yeah.
So at this point, I want to go ahead and talk about some of the linguistic base of the word kobold, and also, interestingly, of the word goblin, which is related and probably related and from a similar root, and all the way to the Welsh version. So in Greek, especially older Greek, one of the earliest references to a goblin-like creature is two goblin-like creatures are the entities known as koboloi. In modern Greek folklore, or late Greek folklore at the very least, it may not be modern, they are these little black creatures that only come to the surface around Christmas to try to do bad things, but then they're driven back below ground, right? But the original conception of them, they're actually referred to in some ancient Greek myths as creatures who steal from Heracles, for instance. There are 2 or 3 koboloi who steal some things from Heracles, but because they're funny, he forgives them and they get away with it. But the word kobold, and to a lesser extent, the word goblin, which sort of can be seen as coming from kobold, and even more the Welsh word koblinau comes from koboloi, and that Welsh koblinau are very much mining spirits. So there may be a conflation of koblinau with kobold that has occurred, since many of the English speakers that are using the word kobold might have heard about koblinau through the Welsh before they ever heard of the German kobold. What do you think about that?
Certainly possible. I mean, folklore always mixes and matches and different things, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
So, as long as you are trying to, as long as you're not working as a scholar, mix and match whatever you want. So
Indeed. Yeah, there isn't, one of the things I say a lot when it comes to mythology and folklore, there is no canon. There are only stories.
Mm-hmm.
There is no, this is the one true thing. This is what a kobold is. This is what a blah is. No. Every story has 1,000 variations. And there, as you say, there's literally nothing wrong with that. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. So we're moving into, at this point, we've talked about kobolds in folklore, and we'll get back to some tie-ins to that, of course. Kobolds in first edition, a little bit about kobolds in second edition. D&D, they haven't really.
There was not much of a shift really between first.
They
were a little more dog-like. It was
Right.
the only real shift. They talk about them like smelling like wet dogs, kind of. They talk about them like they're yipping, kind of. But besides that, there was very little change between first and second edition.
And folklorically, what I want to touch on there is there's another set of medieval creatures that are spoken of in many medieval bestiaries that and come out of originally, I believe, Plutarch and Pliny and their bestiaries, which are kynocephali, which is dog-headed creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And there's references to these sorts of beings across a great deal of medieval myth and folklore. But those are not ever expressed as spirits. They are seen as physical beings that happen to have the heads of dogs. And I'm wondering, and I don't know if Jürgen can give us any insight into how this might have happened, but if there is a connection between those ideas of the kynocephali and the pictures that we have of kynocephali and this more modern conception of kobolds.
I couldn't really say. I mean, there are also lots of dog spirits in German folklore, and they
Right.
also many of them are also shapeshifters, but they are usually not described as kobolds. So
Right.
most common are black dogs, but other varieties are also possible. Often they are black poodles, and sometimes they are described as ghosts, sometimes as hellish spirits, sometimes just some other weird thing that happen to meet people when they walk across the German countryside. There are a lot
Right.
of those.
That's particularly common in a lot of European folklore. This confusion or conflation as to whether a given spiritual entity is its own kind of thing, a subset of fairy, a ghost, or a demon. And the same creature can be described as all of these things under various conditions. And the black dog is very common across Europe in general, from everywhere from Scotland to Germany to France to there are the black dog stories and the things that attach to it all over. So
I do think
I've never quite figured out where the dog-like connection came from in D&D, and it really interests me.
I do think that it's important for us to note, and we talked about this in the last episode with the Firbolgs, where sometimes in D&D, especially in early editions, things happened just because they were cool. And I think that's really important to remember, is there were a lot of decisions that are made in first and second edition, and honestly, even as we go further, that were, we heard the name of this, we have the basic concept, what would make it look different or interesting or scary or cool? And that was something that just happened sometimes, where they just jammed it in there.
To be fair, that happened in the folklore stories as well, as we've discussed.
Sure.
Every time you tell the story, it changes to make it interesting or to make it different. So it's a completely valid expression going forward of the same archetypes and stories. So going from that,
I wanted to say something about that. I mean, I do like the more modern rule sets of D&D better as a player, as a game master, but one thing that I think is fairly unfortunate is the notion that you have to categorize all creatures into different beings. That's a dragon, that's a fairy, that's a ghost, other undead, and so forth and so on. You don't really have that in folklore. So, so a given entity might be a ghost, a demon, a human spirit that wanders around in the night, and while the person who owns it is asleep, or some other kind of spirit. Although I do dislike the term fairies when talking about German folklore. To me, that's a British-Celtic thing.
Oh, I agree. And when I categorize them, as you say, we have a tendency to, unfortunately. I don't generally use anything. I don't use the term fairy for anything specifically other than Celtic folklore, right? Because while there are similarities in the spirit types, fairy is very specifically British and refers to very often things they got from the Celtic natives of the islands. So I'm right with you there, and I think it's unfortunate that a lot of games, for instance, to talk about an entirely different system, Changeling the Lost and the World of Darkness treat everything in that vague spiritual realm as fairies and even call them. And while I love Changeling the Lost and its conceptual framework, I disagree with their take of just lumping every culture's spirits together as fairies, from everything from the east to the west, everywhere.
Well, World of Darkness has a lot of problematic stuff that they've been, to their credit, some of it they've been working on really well. But there are a lot of things that they have a lot of work to do with acknowledging and fixing moving forward, because they've done that and similar things to that for almost as long as they've existed.
Longer, like back when they were lying rampant.
Oh, right. Yes, that's true. I forgot that was a thing. Yes.
Well, I didn't, because I was in Atlanta with some of the founders of Lion Rampant when it started. So
fair.
But anyway, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was 3rd edition kobolds and their connection to dragonkind. And this is a point where I'm going to ask Jürgen again, because he brought something up I did not know about such a connection in German folklore. Jürgen, take it away.
Yeah, so first I have to go back to the role of kobolds as familiar spirits, because kobolds are often portrayed as bringing some stuff like grain, milk, or other foodstuffs, or gold, or jewelry. Yeah, and sometimes it's implied that they steal this stuff from other people, and sometimes they have their own treasure hoard from which they fetch it. So basically, in these interpretations of kobolds, they're the original gold farmer, working for some human master and bringing gold and other valuable stuff. And they can often seen emerging from the chimneys and flying across the sky as a streak of fire or clump of fire. And where in some regions there are creatures called Drache, that's the German word for dragon, which do exactly the same thing. They have a human master, and which they bring food, grain, milk, or gold or jewelry, and bring it to them. And they have to be fed a steady diet of millet or something else, or they turn on their masters. So they are explicitly called Drache or dragon, and sometimes they are also called Drag. And some German folklorists insist that they are different from true dragon, that they are a different kind of thing than the huge reptiles that we are more familiar with. But I personally disagree. I mean, who's to say that a dragon can also be a kobold?
Right, and that gives us our connection as we move into 3rd edition, which I did not know that there was any folkloric connection between dragons and kobolds.
Yeah, neither did I.
Just come up completely from D&D, and it probably did, to be honest. Like, I'm pretty certain they didn't know any of what you shared with us.
Just rolled the die and it happened to work out.
Folklore.
Yeah, it's a really interesting coincidence. That being said, as we move into 3rd edition and 3.5 and onward, kobolds they stay what they've always been, which is trickster creatures that live underground and fight humans, etc., as necessary. Very competent miners, very competent trap makers. But now we find them as a lesser draconic entity, and they haven't specified some of the things yet that they will later, but a vague connection to dragons, a worship of dragons, and serving dragons.
I do think it's really important to note here, because this was also, I mean, the shift from like 2nd edition to 3rd edition and onwards was a major shift mechanically and in terms of lore and concept. But what I think is really interesting here is, like you said, there was a huge overhaul kind of for the kobolds. And it's the 1st edition where we dropped the concept of morale checks, right? Where, for people who don't know, morale checks were something in the first 2 editions of D&D. When you were in fights with groups of creatures or enemies, there were times where you would have to make rolls based on how many of you there were left versus how many of the players there were left. And if you didn't roll high enough, you would skedaddle. You would be gone. You want to get out. And the kobolds were a really good example of this, because as their numbers dwindled, it became significantly more likely that they would leave. This is something that we'd see later down the road become kind of coded into the role-playing concept for the kobolds, and less mechanical, as we got less hard rules on how things like that would work. And this was the 1st edition where they really took that concept and ran with it pretty hard, because having moved the mechanics away from it, so you now had these guys who we had shifted away from the sort of dog-like nature, visage, and whatever else. We decided to go into dragons, and it makes a lot of sense when you take all of the different pieces into account where they could have gotten there even without knowing that folklore, right? Because you've got these creatures who they don't like to be out in the open. They don't like to interact with large crowds. They are very quick to be, I don't want to use the term subjugated, to submit to strong beings. And it created this real, and they already liked to hoard things. They liked to steal. They liked to take. They liked to tinker. And these were things that all made it kind of almost an obvious choice to go, yeah, we'll make them dragonkin. They worship dragons. We'll have them hoard these things for their dragon masters, and that works. And it was able to encompass and incorporate all of these things that they had kind of touched on leading up until this point.
I will point out that another one of the reasons they went into that direction is because in the background lore, which is a whole complicated mess of worms on its own, in the background lore, kobold god Kurtulmak was subjugated by Tiamat because they both lived on the first plane of hell.
Yes.
And thus the kobolds, according to the lore, became subjugated by the dragons in turn. Which, of course, I believe is officially Glittergold's fault.
Is that still? I don't know if that's still canon in 5e, but it was originally at the very least. Yes.
Yeah. So, and what's funny there, of course, is that gnomes and kobolds
hate each other from day one.
Do, but they're fundamentally expressions of the same entity.
Mm-hmm.
They're the same basic kind of creature. So having them expressed that way in D&D terms is amusing to me. It's like the split between a brownie and a boggart.
Well, maybe it makes sense. I mean, if you look at history, most of the hate is between people who are really similar to each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at Germany, there's lots of rivalry between neighboring settlements and communities and cities. I mean, there are lots of folk tales where they are mocking the people in the neighboring village and telling some very stupid incident which allegedly has happened. So
Right.
so maybe familiarity breeds contempt.
Right. It does. Again, it makes a lot of sense if you look at as gnomes and kobolds as factions of the same group in many ways. Of course, the word gnome is a very late addition, and it actually refers to an elemental creature of Earth.
Yeah.
But the concept of the gnome, as we see it, is much more of a variety of spirit types, some of which are forest and nature based, like the little red cap gnomes that you see the pictures of, and some others of which under earth. Because of Paracelsus mainly.
Yeah, or the German types of dwarfs, Zwerge, Wichteln, Unterirdische, and so forth.
Right.
So they are all basically the same thing. So only really distinguishing them from kobolds because they are usually live in groups on the earth.
Right. Right. And of course the German Dwarge and the Norse Dwarge, I don't know if they're pronounced the same. Dwarge.
Zwerg is the German word.
Yeah.
So it's sort of similar.
Yeah. And then you have the conflation and possible identicalness between Dvarga and Svartalf in Norse, because we don't know if they're the same thing or if they're different. But again, they fall into to a certain extent, the Alf in that situation, the elves, of whether they're Leosalfar or Svartalfar, fall into the same general category of beings as the kobold.
Something interesting I found is something. I think in German folklore there's an association between dwarves and the dead. It's not really overt, but for one thing, I mean in southern and central Germany, the dwarves live between hills and mountains. But in northern Germany, where there are very few hills, because it's mostly flatland, they tend to live in barrow mounds.
Right.
And then there's also dwarves live beneath mountains and hills, but there are also all sorts of small abodes of the dead who lives between mountains. It's all over in Germany. So I know of many stories where some dead people living beneath a hill. Sometimes they're just hanging out there, and sometimes they're put there as an explicit punishment for their sins. But this is also a link to older Germanic and Norse folklore, I believe. Or you might know more about that.
I actually have a bunch of interesting connections across both Norse folklore and Irish and Scots folklore in that regard, especially regarding the burial mounds. So the Tuatha De Danann, the Irish gods, later construed as fairies by Christians and etc., are also seen as sometimes the ghosts of the dead, sometimes these other spirits. And they live in the Hollow Hills, which are very often former burial mounds, right? And then in the Norse myths, you have very close to the Dvargar, and also in sound, you have the specific word for barrow wights. It's escaping me. Draugr. Yeah. And there's often a conflation between Dverga and Draugr across some of these things. And one of the interesting things about that, in Norse myth, dwarves are definitely associated with underground, even though they're never referred to as living underground, because they are born from maggots that lived in the flesh of the giant Ymir.
Mhm.
So they are directly children of the earth. Now that also associates them with death, because we associate maggots with decay and with death, right? So I think that maybe, since the Norse comes from that same Proto-Germanic root that the German stuff comes from, obviously, I think that may be some of the reason for that association between dwarves and the dead. Interestingly enough, there's a Cornish spirit called a spriggan, which is described as a dwarf, but it is also the ghost of a dead giant that can temporarily retake its form. We are probably going to be having we have 11 minutes until our ad break. So just a heads up there.
Yeah. I mean, there are some hints in German folklore that these spirits or fairies might actually be the souls of unbaptized children.
Yeah, that a similar reference is made in Irish myth. So that's something that the again, a lot of the cultures that came out of the Proto-Indo-European linguistic and cultural diaspora, which almost all of Europe did, has in common once it is exposed to Christianity. All of those earlier concepts have to be recontextualized in a way that makes sense in terms of there is only one God, and all these other things must be put into a hierarchy or delineation that fits that worldview.
Unfortunately, it is a running theme.
Yeah. So one interesting story from the sets of tales from Tyrol, southwestern Austria, is that there's a spirit Perchta. In other regions of Germany, she's often referred to as Holle or Hulda. She collects the souls of unbaptized children and puts them into a beautiful garden where they can play for all eternity. And after Judgment Day, this will be the only place left of Earth. And there's a particular harrowing story. There's parents who had a newborn child which has died shortly after birth, and the midwife was already away, so she couldn't give an emergency baptism, so the child was unbaptized. So they had a so-called miracle doctor who promised that he could revive the child for long enough so that it could receive a baptism. But when Perchta showed up and read him the riot act and told him, I already, the soul belongs to me, I collect the souls of these children. So, fun stories.
Another thing that we'll eventually cover on this channel, and that's various sources of European vampire myths, because there are a number of types of vampire that are actually children that died young, or unbaptized children, or even children that miscarried. So it's like the Upir and things like that. There's some very nasty ones.
I just recently translated a few of those tales.
Yeah.
So,
I could actually do 6 or 7 episodes just on the various origins of European vampires.
The one one narrative I found that is associated with children is when a child is born with a call above its head, when it's doomed to become I think Anhir is how they call it in that particular story. So it is after they die, they will first kill all their relatives, and when they will knock at the local church bells, then kill everyone who has heard the sound of that bell. And the only way for the mother to prevent the child from becoming an Anhir later after death is to burn the call to ashes and then give it to the child together with the milk.
Yeah.
Happy thoughts.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of really interesting associations, mythology specifically based on what being born with a call means. and that could have 3 or 4 more episodes on its own. Some say there are versions that say you're a werewolf. There are versions that make you in Italy, for instance, there's the Benandanti, which are a type of beneficial witch who are given their power by being born with the call, etc., etc. So yeah, it's a really interesting set. Now that's a little far afield from our kobold stuff, but you know what? We're here to learn all kinds of new things, so I'm okay with it. Captain Button, yes, spriggins are from folklore. They are specifically brought up in Cornish myth, and they have some associations with similar characters and creatures in Irish and Scottish lore that are dwarfish figures that can grow to great size, which is where D&D Duergar got the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into Duergar once again, probably in a later episode, possibly even with Jürgen, since Duergar is a Germanic word source.
I had suggested discussing German dwarfs at a later point.
Nice. Yeah, no, then we'll definitely put that down on the roster for the future. But I will say that spriggins have nothing to do with Skyrim spriggins. They just decided that spriggin sounded like a sprig of wood and made them woodland creatures, which is bizarre. Don't get me wrong, I love Skyrim, I love Elder Scrolls, but I don't know how they got to half of what they did, and that's fine. Stories don't have to, again, there is no canon, stories don't have to be the same.
Yeah.
So, oh, goodness. All right, so here we are firmly in 3rd edition and into 3.5, and we have our kobolds, and they're now draconic. And this is when they start actually being interesting from a PC perspective. This is where people start wanting to play them occasionally. Because until then, they're just seen as annoying to a certain extent. But here in just a few minutes, we will be going to our break. So after we come back from break, we'll start talking about kobolds in 3.5 and maybe 4, and then finally kobolds in 5e. And I'm sure we will also...
And beyond.
And beyond, indeed. And I'm actually going to mention how I handle kobolds in my GURPS Fellhunter setting, which is actually based on German folklore. So... by the way, I have to give props once again to Jürgen for being a great source for a lot of the stuff I've been working into my setting.
You're welcome.
You have been a great deal of help. I heartily recommend everybody check out Jürgen's work. You can find it linked through his Twitter at Franconian Exile. You can look up the castles. Let's see, what was it?
Sunkencastles.com.
Right, sunkencastles.com. Look that up. Take a look at his work because it is really good, very accessible translations. And if you want to know what German folklore said about a lot of interesting creatures, or just have inspiration for stories and plots and creatures in your games or your own writing, it is a great place to go. People often ask me where I get my ideas for things, and honestly, that's where. All right, we're going to go ahead and go to break. I think we're actually in ads right now. I don't know.
I hope not. Nope, we are.
So we're going to go ahead and take our break, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Okay, guys?
Okay. See you then.
Welcome back to Of Gods and Game Masters. This is Myths and Monsters, and today we are talking about kobolds with our special guest, Jürgen Hubert, a fantastic authority on German folklore who has been so kind as to join us and give us all sorts of cool information about the origins of the kobold and how very different it is from what we normally see in tabletop role playing. That being the case, I'm going to step back a quick minute because we were up to 3.0 and 3.5 in Dungeons and Dragons regarding the kobold, and I wanted to mention one of the reasons I thought of Tucker's kobolds and kobolds as effective villains and monsters as being a 2E thing, even though it does start earlier, as Lion pointed out, was the existence of the adventure Dragon Mountain, in which this plane shifting mountain appears and it has a dragon in it, but your primary foes throughout the whole thing are tons and tons of clever little kobolds. And this is one of the things that really cemented, again, a kobold dragon connection in Dungeons and Dragons. But Jürgen had a few things to tell us about the tricky art of kobold disposal.
Yeah, so like I said, in German folklore, kobolds are generally considered spirits. And the general way of dealing with spirits is to imprison them in some small container and then, or otherwise magically bind them to a remote location. So we have some story where a kobold is locked into a small iron box, and then people dug it up, and then the kobold emerges, I'm free again, and really starts doing pranks on the local farm again. Mm-hmm. So opening that container is unwise. And the thing is, in German folklore in general, spirits can't just pass through inanimate objects. This also includes ghosts. They can't pass through walls. They can change their shape and they can become amorphous. They can go through very small cracks and openings. But if the container is closed, even if it's something as simple as a sack, they can't just go through it.
Right.
So a lot of so there are specialized people who can do exorcism, either it's some priests, but these priests often have to be free of sin. So there's often some story, including one with a kobold, where a priest confronts the spirit, and when the spirit, in this case the kobold, says, "No, you can't exorcise me because at one point you walked through a grain field and then an ear of grain got caught in your shoes, and so you stole it. You're not free of sins, you have no power over me." Or maybe when you were a child, you stole an egg or something. But you're not free of sin, you have no power over me. And so, and that story with kobolds stays free, and that was a familiar kobold who had to do lots of chores for his master. But when the master accidentally set him free and the kobold got terrible revenge, he imprisoned the man in one half of his own room. And then he had to stay in that half of the room, and the kobold threatened to snap his neck if he ever went outside of it. And the man cried for help, and lots of exorcists came, but none of them could help him because none of them were free of sin. And when the kobold all told them off, and there are only two people in the whole world who have power over me. One who lives in the farthest west, the other one in the farthest east. You have no chance. And he also made the man immortal, so he had to spend all of eternity inside his half of the room, or so the story goes.
Wow.
Yeah, but
it's, again, that extreme level of response to petty things, and also that attention to tiny, tiny loopholes and details. That we get the reference, the devil is in the details, from this very sort of event. And it's found across spiritual interactions, across mythology in general. And the thing about putting the kobold in a box makes me think of, I believe it's a German story, of a snuff box that has three little beings in it, and its owner can open the snuff box and ask them to do things. Somewhat, again, like a familiar spirit.
Yes.
Much like a genie in Arabic myth. you might only have a certain number of times you can ask them to do something, or only certain things you can ask them to do. And if you break those rules, they are then free and will punish you for the effrontery of having had command over them.
I may be thinking of the wrong one, but that sounds very similar to a tale I've heard, and I think it's Romani in origin.
I know that there is a Romani tale like that, but then, of course, the Romani have tales, many tales of their own. I'm going to get Penny Blake on this channel at some point,
please,
for express purposes. But they also have gathered up stories from all the other places they've been to and through.
That's true. No.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of tales in Germany about some spirits imprisoned in a box or in a bottle or something, and who bring them a master's fortune and riches, but also forfeit the souls of a devil. So the Brothers Grimm also discuss one such entity in their German Legends collection, and it has a very nice Lovecraftian line. It looks not quite like a spider, not quite like a scorpion, but it moves constantly. And it's too bad that they didn't actually get that from Folklore, but they stole it from I think, 16th century adventure novel. Or no, 17th century, but I suppose it was still part of the beliefs of the time. And such tales of familiar spirits imprisoned and in bottles were very common.
That's an interesting description, and I saw your description of the almost spider, almost scorpion thing a few days ago, or a few weeks ago even, and I am quite interested in doing a little more research and maybe statting such a creature out. But so at this point, we're going to go ahead and move on from Dragon Mountain and into 3.0 and 3.5. And we've talked about how they're much more draconic in nature now, right? The change into 4th edition isn't a big one. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan.
No, I mean, I have an inherent bias when it comes to 4th edition a lot of the time, specifically with how it handles stuff like this. So no, there wasn't a lot of conceptual change. No. And it was an edition that, unlike with the Firbolgs, and I'll do that a lot, but unlike with the Firbolgs, you did eventually get the option to play as them, which was cool. But no, there wasn't a lot of technical or conceptual change from 3 to 4, besides it being a game that focused very heavily on combat, and as such, worked very hard to focus on a lot of the monster-like qualities of the kobold, as opposed to the cultural concepts of the kobold that we had seen fleshed out, especially in like 3rd edition, and we'll see more of in 5, but we'll get to that.
Right. And obviously all these things are very different, as we've pointed out, from the folkloric conception of the kobold, which is not something you could beat in a fight. Generally speaking, it's not something you'd even try to beat in a fight.
No.
The great majority of monsters across European myth are not things you beat in a fight. They're something you beat with faith, or with the appropriate rituals, or with, just their specific weakness, which is very rarely some method of murdering them. Occasionally for some types of undead. And as we pointed out earlier, the dragon, who seems to be primarily just susceptible to excessive violence and heavy armor.
It's strange how that works.
Well, there is one other character who is surprisingly susceptible to violence, the devil.
That's true. Yeah. Yep.
More than one tale where he's beaten up with physical force, but was tricked into being on the receiving end of physical force, and, well, they win. Although my personal hypothesis is that the characters that appear in German folklore as the devil are just sort of roving entities which are interpreted by the human observers as the devil, but really are some level beings. You notice that they never actually say that they are devil, but they use some other names, like Herr Haunerfraud and other names.
Right.
And because if they succeed in the scheme and get a soul, the devil gets the credit, and he's the boss, he deserves the credit. But if they actually fail, which they do very, very often, then it's not actually the devil's fault.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, because they're the devil in the same way that an angel might be, speaking for the Lord.
Yeah.
They carry his name, they do his bidding, but if they mess up, it's on them.
Yeah. A fair and balanced system, if I ever saw one.
So,
but enough about politics.
There are too many devils in our modern politics for us to go into right now.
Yes.
And plenty of kobolds, too.
Oh, so true.
Anyway, so fourth edition is kind of a speed bump there. From my perspective, there's not a lot to add to from the lore perspective, which is what we deal with here. We're not really dealing with the mechanics of a game, right? Because we're here to talk about folklore and lore and how they interact with tabletop role playing.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is worth mentioning now that I think about it, and I could be wrong, I have to fact check this, but I do think that 4th edition did implement mechanics for the first time as a player character where you would be inherently better at tinkering with things as a kobold. I believe it was 4th edition that started that. I could be wrong. Feel free to fact check me over in chat. I will fact check myself after the stream as well, and if I am wrong, I'll put something out on Twitter about it. But I do believe that was where it first happened, where as a player character, because that was introduced in 3, where you could play as a kobold, but it wasn't until 4 where there was mechanical advantages for it.
Okay, so we're going to go a little bit sideways here because we've talked about 3.0 and 4. So we're going to also talk about Pathfinder now, because Pathfinder is happened at the same time as 4, as we know, basically, as a response to a large section of the gaming community not really wanting to go in the direction that 4.0 went.
Mm-hmm.
And the kobolds in Pathfinder are very much, at least initially, the same kobolds from 3.5. But they seem to have, from my perspective, delved even deeper into the draconic connections. You see kobolds of multiple colors associated with dragons of that color in Pathfinder. I think that's one of the first places where that happens. And I will delve into that a little bit deeper after we get through 5.0 because I have my own take on it and why, how we went that way. But the Pathfinder kobold, again, isn't a big step forward or a big change from the 3.5 kobold. Except, again, as we do have a picture of it, it is blue. So this is the first example of a kobold being what I might call the right color from the version of the mine kobolds that we talked about at the beginning with the connection to the mineral cobalt. But they have kobolds of every color in Pathfinder because they're directly connected to their dragons. And I think that becomes even more the case in Pathfinder 2. So, moving on from that, fundamentally we see that the tabletop role-playing kobold is just one expression of specifically the mine kobold filtered through the goblin lens into a species of nasty little tricksters who keep their spiteful and excessive responses to things, right?
Yeah.
The logical connections therefrom and the logical connections to the dragon, which we've seen develop a number of different ways, including the one we didn't know about, which was the Drak or Drakon as familiar spirit and kobold as familiar spirit connection. And in 5e, like with so many of the species, we get more of them as a people. As a biological entity than we have prior. And I'm gonna go into why I think that was a mistake, as I said in the broadcast on evil races that we're doing on the 28th. But it is useful for people who want to play them and for fleshing them out as antagonists, for them to have a background and a culture and something to draw on while role-playing them, right? But I think it's useful to look back at the myths and legends that Jürgen has told us about to get an idea of their basic attitudes, because they still mesh, right? You're looking at the pettiness and rules lawyeriness right? Because they're still a lawful evil group. So being sticklers for the contract and being sticklers for the loopholes, to me, makes sense. What do you think about that, Jürgen?
Yeah, I mean, so depends. I mean, there's kobolds which have been bound by familiars and obey very specific rules, but there are also others which are just a nuisance. So they do what they want, and they want to prank people, they want to annoy people, they want to cause a big ruckus. So they are really all sorts of kobolds. And that brings back to my earlier point, because kobold was a very generic term in German folklore.
Right.
So there's in one region there's a strong association with kobolds as familiar spirits. In others there are more generic household spirits, which are tied to specific houses, or the Klabautermänner, which we haven't talked about yet, with shipboard spirits, which
Go
are
ahead and talk about the Klabautermann then, because I don't know if we're going to find a more I don't think we're going to find a better segue.
Yeah, so basically, Klabautermänner and Klabautermen function as shipboard spirits, similar to kobolds as household spirits. They take care of a ship, they do some chores when no one is looking, they are unseen, they assist sailors who are diligent and do their work, but punish those who are lazy. But nobody ever sees them until the ship is doomed. When they become visible and they leave the ship, and that's when all the sailors know the ship is doomed, we should either leave the ship or prepare for our deaths.
Right.
And there's also...
Do they give a physical description of the Klabautermann?
I think a little man is the most we get. Mostly they're invisible,
right,
or otherwise unseen. But there are some interesting stories about them, that they're basically they used to be the spirit of a person. So there's a method, if a child has a broken bone, or a bone that has grown wrong, then they supposed to crawl through the roots in certain trees, and that will fix the bone, set the bone straight. Mm-hmm. However, when the spirit of a child is tied to the tree, and if a tree is later cut down and used to build a ship, then the spirit of a child, or later adult, becomes the Klabautermann for the ship.
Do some of the household kobolds have a similar origin, like a child buried under the foundation or something like that? Because we've seen that sort of theme in other stories, right? Where
not directly to kobolds, but
the graveyard becomes the guardian thereof, etc., etc.
But now that you mentioned, there are quite a few tales in Germany about how a child born to an out of wedlock to a mother is bought by people who want to build a major new building, a cathedral, a fortress, a castle, or something like that. And when the child gets walled into the foundations of that building while alive. And this is supposed to protect that building from any kind of harm, from war or storms or something like that. So maybe that's it's never mentioned explicitly in the story, but maybe the child also becomes a household spirit or protective spirit for that building.
Right, right. Interesting. Yeah, there's so many potential connections in the backstories, and if you think of them just as stories that people made up, it's one thing. If you then think of them as in universe for a fantasy world, then you have to think about the connections and where they first came from, right? You have to, in some cases, be able to answer, is this a thing that happened? Did these familiar household spirits come from a sacrifice of this nature? And in some cases, those you get some very dark results when you look back that way.
And I just had an idea for an upcoming role-playing game campaign, which I'm currently planning.
Good.
Awesome.
So hopefully we'll give a lot of people ideas with these.
Yeah, that's part of why we do this, right? Is to be able to provide those new avenues of thought and insight so that you can take these home and make cool stuff.
Indeed. Indeed. That, and it's just so much fun to explore the backstory and background of all these things.
Oh, for sure.
So now we know the 5e and the Pathfinder kobolds, they really all are the same basic creature. And they're definitely draconic in nature, and we know where they've gone. In some systems and settings, in addition to being described as dog-like, a kobold is described as rat-like. And you have this small rat-like creature, right? And to a certain extent, like the ratkin and the isoki and the mouselings and all these are actually, they're again another flavor of the same thing, basically, because the isoki are also very tech-oriented and clever and manipulative. And in some French folklore, I believe, maybe some Germanic, there are little mouse-like humanoids that act in some similar ways to a brownie or the household spirit version of a kobold. So it's kind of a sideways concept.
Interesting.
I hadn't heard of that one before.
Yeah, neither have I.
I think it's French, actually, because there's a reference in Rise of the Guardians to the French section of the Tooth Fairies people being mice.
Interesting. Okay, cool. I do actually, because we are starting to touch on like 5th edition kobolds, right? I do want to talk about 5th edition kobolds a bit, because there are some interesting things that happen there.
Go ahead.
It's where we see the codification of the idea of pack tactics, right? It's where we come to the inevitable conclusion of Tucker's kobolds. We've gotten here. We found it. It's pack tactics, and it's amazing. And it's one of the two major factors for kobolds as a playable group in 5th edition, with the other one being the grovel, cower, cry actions that they have, which is something I really want to talk about, because so kobolds first became a playable race in 5th edition in Volo's Guide, right? That's where it started. And it was really exciting because there was some really cool stuff. They tried to balance it. I mean, pack tactics is very strong. They tried to balance it. They gave them the sunlight sensitivity because they are still, you know, of the undergrounds, of the deeps, of the mines, whatever you want to call it. So they gave them that. They had the negative to strength, which I know has been reworked now, and we can talk about that in a minute. But it was cool seeing a lot of the things reach these mechanically inevitable conclusions or logical conclusions the way we did as they were presented in 5th edition. But it doesn't end there either. Because while that was how it was for a long time, then we eventually get to Monsters in the Multiverse, which was like the soft reboot for 5th edition, right? Where a lot of things got rewritten and tweaked. And in what I think is still one of the most controversial choices, we lost pack tactics on the kobolds. It was removed. They took it away. They felt like it was too strong. But I feel like, and it bothers me, and this is why I really wanted to talk about this, it really does remove a like core element that they've had since the beginning, and something that is so true to the concept of the creature from 1st edition, from where they made that mark on combat in TTRPGs. And it's a real shame. They also took the opportunity to kind of rewrite the grovel, cower, cry, because they're moving away from kobolds as being cowardly. They're trying to remove those kind of like sweeping generalizations, which is fine. And now they have, I think it's called Draconic Cry or Dragon Cry or something to that effect, which is almost the same effect. It's just rewritten in a way where they don't have to hunch over into like pillbug mode and in order to get the effects. But I think it's really fascinating seeing how they've evolved and how they've grown and how it's been shaped on a mechanical level from 1st edition to now, and then even now how they're still making these shifts for better or worse. Because like I said, I have my feelings on pack tactics.
I think they should have kept pack tactics, but I also think that there's an unfortunate tendency to remove all negative aspects from character choices that I think is probably unwise.
I agree.
I think that there should be inherent negatives to specific choices. It doesn't have to be bioessentialist, but there should be negatives in your choices. You could take minuses to this to get positives to that. That's just my perspective. Because
I totally agree.
Positives to all these things, then by default, you've actually got negatives to the ones you don't have positives to, even though it doesn't look that way. So
it's a hard middle ground to cut, because you end up in this place, and we don't have to go off on this tangent for too long, but you end up in this weird spot where you really want to make sure everyone has fun playing the game, because that's the important part. The important part is to make sure everyone enjoys it. And there are people who are like, well, I want to play this. I don't want to have that downside. Sunlight sensitivity is the example I use for this all the time, right? Where it's like, okay, so if we're not playing in the Underdark, if we're not playing Underground, if we're not playing in Perpetual Night, either you take the route of going, well, this is not something I want to deal with for my character, right? I don't like this, but I really want to play a kobold. Well, there are a couple routes. You can hand wave it and be like, fine, it's not an issue. You were born on the surface, the end, we're done. You can go, here's a cloak, and that will solve it, which is a weird hand wave, but doable. Or you can lean into it. And it does get a little weird when you take into account that these are all valid ways to go about resolving that issue. But none of them should inherently be loud enough to be like, we should remove it, because it's easy to resolve, and you can put a footnote in your book to say, hey, here's how you resolve it, without removing, like you said, the detriment being a built-in concept for them. Because I really like that part of building a character.
This is one of the reasons I like GURPS, because it gives you take your negatives that may come with your species or ancestry or whatever, and if you want to remove them, you can.
Yeah.
Because they are delineated with the number of points associated. You can take them out, replace them with something else.
Yeah.
And then the species generally always has this problem. You just don't, because blah, and you've taken on some other problem to balance it.
Sure.
One of the things I like about GURPS as opposed to most other systems is that flexibility in building whatever it is you want to play.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons I built GURPS Fell Hunters the way I did. One of the things I leaned into in Fell Hunters, for instance, is not only are my mind kobolds, because I do have, by the way, the whole gamut of kobolds. They're a group of entities that share their size, but mind kobolds specifically, along with most of the others, have the ability to become invisible. Because I felt that was really critical for getting into the actual folkloric feel of them.
Yeah.
That most of the time you don't see them.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that in Fell Hunters, my mind kobolds used to be very friendly to humans until humans started turning on them because of their church. And now they're malicious toward the humans because the humans betrayed ancient agreements.
This fits in very well with a particular German folktale. I assume you have read it, where basically a farmer once had a kobold, but when wanted to get rid of a kobold and sent it away. And when the kobold actually sought out another farmer, a relative of the first farmer, and asked him to become a new master. So he showed up in the house, and even on the bed, and shouted, "Take me, take me." Right. So if a kobold appeared on your bed and shouted, take me, how would you take this? So, but anyway, but the second farmer didn't want the kobold either. And so he finally agreed to take the kobold if the kobold would say a prayer together with him, but the kobold just couldn't do it. And then had to break off, and then said basically, "Stop this, I'm out of here."
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's another, that's an ongoing theme with a lot of the mythological and folklore creatures, is that either due to their disdain for, or the church's disdain for them, they cannot speak the Christian words, they cannot say, they cannot make the Christian prayers, they can't speak the name of the Christian God. And that to ask them to do so is either so offensive they leave or physically hurts them. That being, again, part of that kobold disposal tactics that don't involve violence. But yeah, so that's where I went with my GURPS Fell Hunters kobolds, and I'm glad to hear that it matches, because I thought it did based on the research I had done. But when it comes to D&D style kobolds, and 5th edition and beyond in this case for me is going to be probably Tales of the Valiant and core fantasy.
Yep.
by Kobold Press, humorously enough,
Ha.
to tie that right back in there, is I have an article out. I don't know if you've read it. I think you have, Lion. The Alternative Ecology of Dragons.
Yes.
Which explains that in my settings, my 5e D&D-esque settings at least, especially the Successor States of Rhaegar, kobolds are all literally dragon spawn. They are basically tiny dragons, except that they're like drones, like an ant. They're what happens when a dragon has eggs that are not fertilized. They create these small servitors that act like drones and worker ants for them, doing their digging and their mining and their crafting and stuff for them. And then dragons are the soldier ant equivalents.
Dragons as ant queens. I like it.
Yeah. And I have the dragons as very matriarchal with they have harems of males that do their gathering for them, and only the female dragons have hordes. And the males like crows and jackdaws and such gather the riches to impress the female.
I mean, this is a general point about folklore adaptations and of kobolds in specific, and other spirits and spiritual entities in general.
Yeah.
I mean, you have different goals depending on what game you translate folkloric and mythological entities into. I mean, for Dungeons and Dragons and like GURPS Dungeon Fantasy and so on, you assume that these creatures are something that can be fought by a typical band of adventurers.
Right.
This is not generally the case in folk tales because the protagonists are usually peasants who don't really have much experience in fighting such things and are often unable to fight them. I mean, sometimes they try, this often and will not always ends badly for them, but the general assumption is these creatures are not to be fought. This might work in other role-playing games with different kinds of setups from like Call of Cthulhu or Basin, where the assumption is that you don't fight them directly.
Or back to GURPS again. Some applications of GURPS horror work the same way because you're having to deal with the problem, not necessarily fight it. Because what a lot of people who only play D&D don't realize is a great many role-playing games don't have nearly that level of focus on combat. And certainly don't have combat as the only or even primary way to handle your problems.
Yeah.
Especially since fighting them doesn't give out experience points.
Right. Because you get your experience from all the things you're doing rather than how many things you killed. And that's one of the reasons in D&D I use milestone.
Same. Yeah.
Rather than monster XP for just that reason. Back in the old days, it was in some ways better, in some ways worse, because you got your experience from how much gold you had gathered, which at least encouraged you to be glad enough to go around the dragon and steal from it rather than fight. But still, it's very much the professional treasure hunter approach, which I wanted you to touch on real quick for us, because you've mentioned that a few times online, the professional treasure hunters as a real thing in German folklore.
Yeah, so this could easily fill an entire session of us here on its own, so an entire episode, but we should do it, but I can touch a few things. So there was a real treasure mania in early modern Europe. There was lots of people who went organized themselves in groups. So there was it's not like the usual D&D party. So there's usually organizers, so rich, sort of wealthy craftsmen and tradespeople living in the countryside who organize things. Then there are all sorts of workers who helped with the digging, and they also needed someone for the magic. So either they bribed some priests who did the magic for them to find the treasure and unearth the treasure to designate where it was, or some vagabond, because vagabonds were always suspicious of suspected of being magic users. And when they sought out treasures and they find a local site, when they often had to recite some treasure magic, St. Christopher's prayer, for example. And when we had to dig up a treasure, and this treasure was often bound to a soul of a ghost, and the ghost could only be released from the fight from the purgatory if the treasure was unearthed and taken away. But
So
the devil has no.
beneficial for these. It was kind of beneficial for these bound spirits to have somebody find their treasure.
Yes, at least that's how the tales often represented it. But the devil had no interest in such ghosts and souls being released from the torment, so he sent all sorts of illusions and apparitions to scare the treasure hunters away. So, for example, a millstone suspended by a thread was a favorite.
Right.
And
So you
that's
could
something that appeared.
absolutely, you might not be able to do this in D&D, but you could absolutely run a GURPS fantasy or horror campaign with that late European setting where you have a legitimate adventuring party that does this. They have their magic user, maybe even their priest for exorcisms, right? And they go around and they find these treasures, and not only do they enrich themselves, but they're doing good by saving these souls and releasing them. And that could be an interesting premise for a whole game.
One thing that I think maybe tricky to implement in a role-playing game is a convention that once you start the digging process, nobody of the people present may say a single word, or else the treasure will sink back into the earth and will no longer be recoverable.
Wow. That's harsh.
So
I know a lot of people who could not make it through 5 minutes like that. I might not be able to. Who knows?
Yeah, so, but how do you represent this in the game? So do you just enforce that the players may not say anything as characters and be really harsh in enforcing this, including coordinating the saves, or do you require some sort of will saves? So
Possibly both.
I haven't found a good solution for this yet.
It's tough.
Well, we can talk about that at another time. So we're coming up real close on the end of our wonderful chat. I have greatly enjoyed this. So what I'm going to do now is give folks a chance to, give their outro again. Above me, from my perspective, around me, down to in the screen, I think he's down to my right. Lion is my producer, my partner, great guy. I cannot do this stuff without him. So go ahead and give us a quick rundown so we can get out of here.
Hi, I'm Lion. You can find me on... I'm sorry, let me do that again, now that I'm not choking to death. Hi, I'm Lion. I am the creative director and founder for Tales from the Table Studios. You can find me on Twitter over at LionKnight42 or at TFTT Studios on Twitter, or Tales from the Table Studios on any other social media, because we do all stuff on there. You can also find me here, because this is amazing and I absolutely love doing this, and it's so much fun and there's always so much to learn. This is great, and you'll be able to see me actually tomorrow over on RPGs Uncovered when I go from sitting here with like that. When I go from sitting here with Jack to sitting with a different Jack, where I'm going to be playing my absolute worst, most heinous human being I've ever created ever, and I'm so excited for you all to meet Chad. That's
Sounds like a blast. All right, Jürgen, tell us once again where people can find you, how they can get your books, how they can support you, and make your journey as a folklore specialist easier.
So it's best if you just go to my website, sunkencastles.com. I think it's mentioned in the chat a bit earlier. And there you get links to my social media presences on Mastodon and Facebook, and also to my Patreon. You'll find also some cool interactive maps where I linked all the folk tales I've translated to the real-world locations in Germany where they took place. And just follow me there, look around, and if you want to follow me on any of these sites, you are welcome.
It's worth doing. I follow Jürgen on both Twitter and on Mastodon, and I find out new things on a regular basis because I do so. It is definitely worthwhile, and I heartily recommend that everyone with an interest in folklore, which should, if you're paying attention, be everyone with an interest in tabletop role-playing games, should follow and pay attention to Jürgen.
If you have any interest in... Oh, I'm just going to say real
All
quick,
right.
if you don't mind me jumping in. If you have any interest in building worlds, building characters, building storylines, building folklore, building lore for your own world, or just want to expand your knowledge so that when you sit down at a table, you have new cool ideas to work with, you have nothing to lose. Go do it. Takes 2 seconds to follow.
Indeed. And it's free. I have been Jack Kellum, Jack Gogsbane, Jack the Giant Killer. I run Of Gods and Game Masters, and this is the intersection of myth, folklore, and tabletop role playing. And on Fridays, we will be continuing to cover other monsters with different folklore experts. And on Sundays, coming up, especially on May 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, you will see us again, at least myself and Lion, with a star-studded and diverse cast of
The best cast.
Of academics, creatives, and performers talking about the role of evil races in tabletop roleplay. It should be a complicated and nuanced discussion, and hopefully we'll get a lot of it into the 2-hour running span that we have intended. Thank you all for paying attention to us and hanging out with us. I have had a great deal of fun. Thank you very much, Lion. Thank you very much, Jürgen. I will definitely arrange to get you back on the show, Jürgen, for some more interesting German folklore stuff, like specifically maybe an episode on the treasure hunters.
Yes.
Like other specific monsters and creatures we want to talk about as well. All right. Thank you very much. And let's go ahead and go. We're out. Love ya.